With the 2024 Spooktober season having come to a close, it only makes sense that our final horror review for this season will be the biggest horror release of the year, being Bloober Team's remake of the classic Silent Hill 2. As someone who was way too chicken to play any real horror games until I was in my 20s but was always interested in them, Silent Hill is a series incredibly well known not just to me, but to the survival horror space as a whole. Back in the day, it could be said that the only series to rival Silent Hill was Resident Evil, but as times have gone on, Resident Evil has successfully grown and evolved with the gaming landscape, while Silent Hill has definitely struggled to do so, and faded more into the background. With Konami's grand return to gaming in recent times, they've seen fit not just to bring back this classic series, but to get perhaps the biggest name in horror for the past decade, with Bloober Team being given the keys to this legendary game and tasked with evolving and modernising it for current consoles and the modern gaming generation. The name Bloober Team may or may not be familiar to you, having developed games such as Layers of Fear, Observer, and 2019's Blair Witch game. Those that know them know that their track record can be a little hit and miss, so it's expected that gamers were just a little skeptical of how Bloober would handle remaking this absolute horror classic. I'm here to be the bearer of good news. Bloober Team have made not just a great modern version of a classic survival horror game, their remake of Silent Hill 2 is up there competing with the likes of Dead Space for the title of greatest horror game that I have ever played. With that giant band-aid ripped off, let's go part by part and dissect just what makes this remake so great. Silent Hill 2 is a story about people, about some of the darkest emotions that we as people can feel, about loss, regret, trauma, about mental illness, and about a haunted town that can and will make you confront all these horrific things that you go through in your life. Our protagonist for this game is James Sunderland, a regular-ass white dude in his early to mid-30s who arrives in the quaint holiday town of Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his wife, who tragically died of cancer 3 years prior to the events of the game. James immediately comes across as a broken, lost, and confused man who cares very little for himself, not only due to the events of the game and what he'll put himself through to find the answers he seeks, but also in the way that cutscenes and character interactions occur. Silent Hill isn't normally a small touristy town in Maine, but eagle-eyed viewers might notice that this description and the locations seen in this gameplay don't exactly match up. Something is very wrong with the town, as it is entirely covered in fog, there are monsters everywhere, and unrealistic damage and blockades have majorly changed what this little town should normally be. James Sunderland is not the only person who's ended up in this foggy town of nightmares. There are a small handful of others that James will find during his search of the town that each have their own demons and traumas that they too are fighting through in parallel to James's journey. The interactions between James and these other characters might be few and far between, but they are such a highlight when they do happen because they are so unsettling, gross or mysterious, and the cutscenes are directed in a way that they all have an eerie feel of something like the Red Room scenes in Twin Peaks. I mentioned in my last review for 2019's Medieval remake that if a spooky game is a more serious horror vibe, then I prefer it to have a much more serious and deep story, and this game is probably the best example I have ever come across of a game that nails that idea perfectly. This is absolutely my favourite story I've ever played in a horror game, thanks to amazing voice acting, cutscenes with a Lynchian awkwardness but even darker and more depressing, and the exact themes that I enjoy in my horror stories. It's been a bit over a week since I finished the game, and I'm only just writing this review now because for the past week I've been mulling over everything the narrative offers here, what these characters must feel and what the implications for it all are. If any of you know some horror movies that have a very similar vibe to the story of Silent Hill 2, then please comment them down below because I will never have enough of this type of horror storytelling. If I keep talking about the story, then I'm either just going to keep glazing it or end up spoiling everything, so let's move on to the gameplay. This 2024 remake of Silent Hill 2 is obviously taking what the original game did back in 2001, expanding on both the ideas and the scope, and then twisting just enough to make the game feel like a more modern horror game. I've actually played the first few hours of both the original Silent Hill and Silent Hill 2, but I have to admit that I've never gotten any further than just the first level or so in either game, because I've always felt the controls and combat to be much too clunky and unenjoyable for my tastes. I've always understood that with the everyman kind of vibe that this series went for with its protagonists, the combat was somewhat clunky on purpose, but I just never found that to be a good enough reason to persevere with the systems that feel bad to play. So seeing that this remake had completely reinvented the combat gave me a very big drive to want to play it. You'll still be doing all the typical Silent Hill things in this game. You'll be doing a hell of a lot of exploring the town and various locations within it, searching and looting for resources such as health and ammo, looking for items and solving puzzles, and lastly of course, fighting off the many horrors that the town demands James face. All of this core is identical to the original game, but how all of these are executed is what makes this remake stand on its own 2 feet. For starters, even just basic movement feels so much better in this game than the original Silent Hill games. Tank controls or any variation of them are gone and replaced with a much more modern control scheme that reminds me a lot of the recent Resident Evil games with its over-the-shoulder but slow movement. A lot of the puzzles are still intact or have been tweaked to work slightly differently, and any that have been removed outright have been replaced with these charming little vignettes that show you that even if there's nothing important here now, there previously was. The biggest change in this remake when it comes to the gameplay would definitely be the combat, and I'm glad to say that I do actually quite enjoy it this time around. Combat is broken down into 2 areas, melee and ranged. Melee combat's pretty straightforward. When you press the melee button, you kind of soft lock onto the enemy that's in front and center of the camera, and you can keep pressing the melee button to perform a basic 3-hit combo. On paper, these mechanics make it sound like combat's going to be really easy, until you fight your first enemy and find out that enemies can get their attacks started up extremely quickly, and sometimes interrupt your attack string to hit you with some big damage, so you're gonna need to stay on your toes and use a well-timed dodge to avoid it. Mastering the dodge is more or less mastering the melee combat. Don't be afraid if it takes you more than a few hours to get there. Ranged combat is a fairly straightforward affair. You have a small few guns on offer, such as a handgun and a shotgun, that each work best for different encounters, and there's enough sway with the aiming that you really have to be hesitant to make sure that your shot is accurate rather than just letting loose. There's not much variety with the gunplay on offer, so it might sound a little boring, but bullets can sometimes be quite few and far between that unless you're checking every nook and cranny for ammo, you'll want to use your guns as little as possible and save them for almost a get out of jail free moment, rather than as your normal combat method. Supplies are honestly very soothing and satisfying to find here in Silent Hill 2. As you comb through levels, you'll find ammo and healing items stashed in drawers and cupboards, and also by breaking some car windows. The last major change that this remake sees compared to the original is with its level design. So with that in mind, let's move on to the design part of the review. For anyone like me whose first trip this is to Silent Hill, the design of the game is likely going to be what sits in your brain for the longest after playing this game. The level design and progression is largely the same as the original version of Silent Hill 2, but liberties have been taken to greatly expand the content in this area. The original game would have its playtime last from approximately 8 to 10 hours, but so many areas are a lot bigger and more expanded that my playtime in the remake here was about 18.5 hours. Granted, some parts of it I was scared out of my mind and moving at a snail's pace, but that's beside the point. The overworld of the town Silent Hill has a couple of extra objectives and stop-offs you'll be making between key moments of the game, and dungeons are so large with so many rooms and floors in them that I could beat an early Resident Evil game in less time than some of the levels here take. I do appreciate that Bloober Team managed to very naturally expand and stretch out the length and scope of this game without losing or compromising on the original vision. I didn't even realise that this remake was a lot longer than the original because so much of the game felt so natural that I figured it was almost an exact copy-paste with the dungeons. Speaking of the dungeons, and I guess the town itself by extension, this is both one of the prettiest and most disgusting games that I have ever played. The graphics are honestly really damn good on the PS5's performance mode, with some parts of the town looking downright dreamy in a very eerie way, but man, when this game wants to get grimy and gruesome, it sure can. I've played a fair number of horror games, but believe me when I say that some of the areas of this game have the absolute scariest imagery and vibe I've played, and sometimes I was held back with progressing further throughout the game simply because the design of the areas was creeping me out enough that I didn't want to move forward. It's not quite a Saw-like aesthetic like the Evil Within has, nor the slight gothic theme that some of the early Resident Evil games have, but rather a very grungy and rotten look that looks like the absolute worst place you could ever want to be that could truly exist in the real world. The sound design is absolutely phenomenal and carries so much of the scare factor here. Thanks to the radio that you always have on you, you'll very much hear when an enemy is nearby because your game will throw out a very uncomfortable static noise that'll make you second guess playing through this. Everything sounds creepy here. From your own steps to opening doors to enemy movements, you're gonna feel an almost permanent sense of unease during your journey here. Like I mentioned earlier, the voice acting is perfect and nails the uncomfortable and uncanny feeling it is going for, and the soundtrack is so beautiful that the two complement each other beautifully. I've always known that the soundtrack for Silent Hill 2 by Akira Yamaoka was a fan favourite, but I wasn't expecting it to be quite so beautiful. The last thing to talk about when it comes to the design is one of the biggest ones, and that would be the enemy design. The enemy roster, truth be told, is a little smaller than I would have liked to have seen. They do look scary as hell, and the way they're animated genuinely did make me jump in my chair more than a few times. You've got some that have a projectile attack, some faster, more melee enemies, and a few other types in here that have been added or retooled to fit the game's more modern gameplay style, which is nice, but about a third of the enemy types in the game are more or less reskins of other enemies, which I would have loved to have seen them get a much more distinct design. While the enemies might be great visually, they're all fought in pretty much the same way, so as long as you've got ammo available and have your melee skills down, it doesn't really matter which enemy you're up against. Now that we've gone over the key sections of the game, what is the overall verdict? Before we get into the conclusion, go ahead and do me a favour and scroll down just a little there and hit that subscribe button. We've still got plenty of reviews coming before the end of the year and you don't want to miss out. On with the finale. I have to give the Silent Hill 2 remake props for being the first horror game in nearly a decade to make me actually feel afraid. This is my exact horror game. One that is more about atmosphere and tone, with absolutely great work in everything from sound to story. There's no focus on tasteless jump scares, none of the cheap and lame tricks that so many horror games use. It's a testament to just how well made this game and world is that the player's fear is totally natural and not because of scripted sequences. I do appreciate the amount of different difficulty levels on offer for both the combat and puzzles, so that players can create their ideal experience, as well as the several different endings that players can get depending on some of their more subtle decisions in their playstyle, rather than binary dialogue choices. I can't say that it's a perfect experience though. With the game's playtime going on for so long, I do feel like the combat gets a little boring by the end few levels of the game due to the limited variety in both weapons available and enemy types present in the game. This is also just a purely personal critique, but with the length of a playthrough in this remake, I don't feel as inclined to get the other endings compared to other shorter games where a repeat playthrough doesn't take so much time. These points aside though, I do think this is one of my favourite horror games of all time, and I very much hope that if Konami do decide to go ahead with more releases in this franchise, that they follow the more psychological horror theme that this game has compared to the more raw supernatural theme that this series is more commonly known for. I will be giving Bloober Team's Silent Hill 2 remake a score of 9.5 out of 10. Releases like this are why I am so happy to see Konami return to video games. They've been sitting on a treasure trove of games for far too long, and I hope that this tells them that these series are still absolutely ripe with potential and worth revisiting. That's going to be it for today, guys. See you in the next review.